Welcome to Bloor Street United Church, gathered in the parlor with a bit of a summer vibe starting. Feels good to gather on this first Sunday in June, the first Sunday in Pride Month. Bloor Street United has been an affirming congregation since 1995. At the same time, last year in 2025, the United Church of Canada offered an apology to two LGBTQ+ peoples and communities, naming the real harm caused through words and actions, silence and systems that failed to protect and affirm God's beloved people. This Pride Month, the Church, including this one, reflects on that apology, not as an ending, but as a beginning. A threshold into deeper healing, accountability, and transformation. Pride is more than celebration. It is remembrance. It is resistance. It is a witness to the sacred truth that every identity rooted in love and authenticity is a divine gift. Radical belonging is not optional. It is at the heart of the gospel. And so we here continue the work of becoming a church that acts with courage, continues to learn, and that lives out love in word and deed. I find some wisdom in a poem by Judy Brown, a Quaker and a U.S. leadership educator, author, poet, whose work revolves around themes of leadership and dialogue and creativity. This is Judy Brown's poem, Fire. What makes a fire burn is the space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs, packed in too tight, can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would. So building fires requires attention to the spaces in between, as much as to the wood. When we are able to build open spaces in the same way we've learned to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel and absence of fuel together that make fire possible. We only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. A fire grows simply because the space is there, with openings in which the flame that knows just how it wants to burn could find its way. However you have come to this time, whether you are on Zoom or here in the gathering space at St. Matthew's, it's good to have you here. This place is safe. This place is safe for questions, safe for doubt, safe for vulnerability, safe for healing, safe for love. What happens as we gather and explore stories, and as we are met by God's Spirit in this place, will be different because you're here, because you are a part of it. I invite you to join me as we acknowledge the land on which we gather. We recognize that we gather on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. That is now home to diverse Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This land has been cared for by the Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and currently the Mississaugas of the Credit for thousands of years. Let us be mindful of our broken covenants and the need to make right with all our relations. And we also light a candle, not to invite God's presence, for God is always with us, inviting us, in fact, to join with God's Spirit in community and in life. And so we light this candle to remind us of that unflinching presence and to reaffirm the promise of new beginnings in the light of Christ as we go together. The light of Christ.
In Matthew 9, Jesus covers a lot of ground. If this is one of Jesus' normal days, then his work-life balance is definitely off-kilter. In fact, given how he seems to be unfailingly interruptible, we might even say that Jesus has boundary issues. In the course of the day, Jesus sees Matthew, a tax collector, and calls him to follow, then follows Matthew to his home for a meal. There, Jesus is drawn into a debate with the Pharisees about why he and his followers don't fast, and in response, he shares two vivid images of using unshrunk cloth to repair an old cloak and putting new wine into old wineskins. Meanwhile, a powerful local leader approaches Jesus, desperate about his sick daughter, so Jesus heads off to have a look. On the way, a woman, frantic over hemorrhaging that has lasted for 12 years, touches his gown, and he stops to talk with her. Finally, he carries on to the house to see the little girl and heals her. So, we might wonder, does Jesus then go back to Matthew's to finish his meal? Well, let's take this a little more slowly. Maybe there are some clues. Reading from Matthew chapter 9, beginning with the 9th verse. As Jesus continued on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a kiosk for collecting taxes. He said to him, "Follow me." And Matthew got up and followed him. As Jesus sat down to eat in Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners joined Jesus and his disciples at the table. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard it, he said, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, but sick people do. Go and learn what this means. I want mercy and not sacrifice. I didn't come to call righteous people, but sinners." At that time, John's disciples came and asked Jesus, "Why do we and the Pharisees frequently fast, but your disciples never fast?" Jesus responded, "The wedding guests can't mourn while the groom is still with them, can they? But the days will come when the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one sews a piece of new unshrunk cloth on old clothes, because the patch tears away the cloth and makes a worse tear. No one pours new wine into old wineskins, but if they did, the wineskins would burst, the wine would spill, and the wineskins would be ruined. Instead, people pour new wine into new wineskins, so that both are kept safe." While Jesus was speaking to them, a ruler came and knelt in front of him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and place your hand on her, and she'll live." So Jesus and his disciples got up and went with him. Then a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years came up behind Jesus and touched the hem of his clothes. She thought, "If only I touch his robe, I'll be healed." When Jesus turned and saw her, he said, "Be encouraged, daughter. Your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed from that time on. When Jesus went into the ruler's house, he saw the flute players and the distressed crowd. He said, "Go away, because the little girl isn't dead, but is asleep." But they laughed at him. After he had sent the crowd away, Jesus went in and touched her hand, and the little girl rose up. News about this spread throughout that whole region. In these readings, we hear God's voice. God is still speaking. Thanks be to God.
In a few minutes, we're going to have some time for discussion. And to help us in that, here's a question to ponder while I offer some thoughts on Matthew 9. So, in November 1953, Archbishop Walter Barfoot, primate of what was then called the Church of England in Canada, laid the cornerstone for a new building at 600 Jarvis Street in Toronto, which would serve as the church's national office known as Church House until 2004. When 600 Jarvis was then demolished to make way for a residential and office building on Hayden Street, where the Anglican offices moved, the cornerstone disappeared. In April this year, the time capsule that was in the cornerstone was recovered. A construction worker whose curiosity took the better of him had an attack of conscience and returned the contents. They included a recent copy of the Canadian Churchman, then the National Magazine, as well as a copy of the Globe and Mail containing a column by Archbishop Robert Renison reflecting the influence of the church in society at the time. Documents from recent meetings highlighted the scourge of communism and the injustice experienced by women deacons who were paid very little, were required to be single, meaning that they had no income or pensions from their husbands, and who received no income at all when they retired. If we were to insert a time capsule in the concrete of 300 Bloor West today, what would we include? What would we place there to provide testimony to future generations of our moment and our legacy and our hope? What would you include in it to capture our context, our challenges, our achievements, and our outlook on the church and the world? That's your question for later. In her 2008 book, The Great Emergence, How Christianity is Changing and Why, Phyllis Tickle, the sociologist of religion, observes that every 500 years or so, the church has a giant rummage sale. Old traditions, structures, forms, and practices are set aside to make room for the new. Beginning with Jesus and the early church, every 500 years, there's been a huge disruption, a major shift in the church. In the year 500, it was the fall of Rome and the emergence of the papacy and monasticism. In the year 1000, it was the schism between East and West, which resulted in Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. In 1500, it was the Protestant Reformations. And she says that three things happen when the church holds an every 500-year rummage sale. First, a new vital form of Christianity emerges. The older dominant form is reconstituted into a less rigid and better expression and becomes stronger. And each time the faith spreads dramatically. You see what's coming. Phyllis Tickle argues that we are in the midst of an every 500-year rummage sale. Something new is being born that we can't quite see what it is yet. Older established structures, forms, and traditions are shaken. New faith communities are gradually emerging. New followers of Jesus are finding their way to churches that don't work in the ways we are used to. And there have been seismic shifts in the relationship between religion and specifically Christianity in Western societies over the past century or so. As exciting as that may be, there are also items in the church's attic that we shouldn't sell. Things so vital that they must remain a part of what is emerging, to ground what is about to be born in what is good and faithful and true about what has gone before. But let's back up for a moment to Jesus' very busy, interrupted, crammed, full day in Mark 9. The passage comes together around this through line of three healing stories. Matthew's healing of purpose, the healing of a woman with a flow of blood, and a local community leader's daughter. In the story of Matthew's healing of purpose, Jesus crosses moral and social barriers of the time to welcome outsiders. His love is not contingent on their occupation, their moral life, their social standing. His goal is healing. For Matthew, the restoration of vision and spirit is the healing that he requires and receives. Even collaborators collecting tax for the Romans can be healed. Healing involves choosing a new way of life, following Jesus into a world of new values and possibilities. The woman with the flow of blood finds healing as a result of her famously determined faith. And the little girl depends on the faith of others. In either case, faith is transformative. What Jesus says about newness in the midst of all of this, about wineskins and patching clothes, is bookended by these stories of healing. The healing is evidence of something new. A new experience of God is already happening. But God's people are not noticing. They're fasting when God is inviting people to a wedding feast. Now, really, who sits in a corner and ostentatiously keeps their plates and glasses empty, glaring at the others in the midst of a joyful gathering? As we've discovered in our transition work at Bloor Street, changes of many kinds have already happened around us. That's been happening for rather a long time. Transition is managing our response to that change, transforming our life together in response to changes that have already happened around us. Why cling to the rituals of repentance when God is bringing transformation and new life in Jesus? Ironically, God's newness in Jesus leads others to misinterpret what the followers of Jesus do when they work on the Sabbath by plucking corn to eat, or when they don't do like fasting. God's newness runs counter in people's assumptions of how God should work. The Franciscan author Richard Rohr offers an object lesson about why change creates tension in communities like the church, with his image of contents and a container. It expresses the difference between spirit and structure. and their need for one another. There's always a dynamic tension between the living content of spiritual life and the container that our spiritual life needs to function in the world. The Spirit breathes the lively, irrepressible content that always challenges the church's container. The church is continuously adapting itself to changing conditions in order to keep its unchanging mission fresh and effective in whatever time or place. And all of this is closely connected to the experience of both endings and beginnings, and so they involve deep emotions within people. Holding on to a time-sensitive and culturally defined model of church that may have worked once, but no longer meets the needs for a new reality, is to make the container more sacred than the contents. It is this witness that Jesus represents, that something new is happening, that the traditions could not contain or express, that is the source of the conflict he is having with the religious leaders. Now, I must say the Pharisees get a bad rap in the Gospels. You see, they began as a lay reform movement of people who practiced the highest ideals of Jewish faith to preserve the faith in the face of Roman occupation. And it is the Pharisees who will shape the Judaism that we now know as Rabbinic Judaism as it emerges from the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. But for now, Jesus comes on the scene with this freedom in God. He's a creative interpreter of Jewish teachings and practices. Jesus doesn't say that fasting is wrong or doesn't matter. That's not Jesus' way. Not the Jesus who said earlier in Matthew, "Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill." He's not saying don't fast. He's saying that there's a time and a place for that. Now is a time to draw closer to God with celebration and feasting and abundance. Now is a time of newness. He goes on, "I'm bringing a new kind of wine. Wine is a sign of the Spirit on the move in the world. And I'm trying," he says, "to be faithful to where God is leading me and us in this moment right now. If I put that new wine in an old wineskin, it's going to crack. It's going to burst. It's not going to work." Wine was often held in carefully prepared skins of animals, and as the wine fermented in their new skins would stretch without cracking. But you don't reuse a wineskin because it loses that stretchability and it will just burst. And then you'll lose both your serviceable wineskin and the new wine. New wine requires new skins. But you know, old wine can be put into new wineskins too. If the new wine represents God doing something new, bringing life and hope and healing through Jesus, then what are these new wineskins but people and communities who are willing to grow and change and stretch to carry that new thing forward? Jesus was led by the Spirit, and we need to be led by that same Spirit if we are to receive new wine and find new liturgical and other wineskins within which to allow it to ferment and to become ready. So yet again, here we are. We rethink. We re-language. We relive our faith for the 21st century. course, it's easier to talk about wine without the wineskins, to talk about ideas and vision without worrying about ways of bringing them to expression. Or, on the other hand, to talk about the institution without being too distracted by the values and spirit and mission that needs to be poured into it. God's Spirit is about creating new wine. But without new wineskins, changed institutions, systems, and structures, any transformation will not be deep. It will not last. It's a both and. We need both the contents and the container. Likewise, no one takes a new piece of cloth and sews it on old clothes. The patch will shrink as soon as you wash the clothes and rip a bigger hole. Wash the patch a few times first, so it shrinks to the size you need before you sew it on the clothing. This is why when we have been looking here at Bloor Street in new directions for our life together, such as in worship and in music, we experiment. We try something like our sacred jazz gatherings, learning and adapting as we go, and then we will sew that onto the familiar cloak of worship at Bloor Street once it fits. So Jesus says, take your eyes off the wineskins for a minute, the container, and glimpse that new wine where it's already being poured. God's Spirit is on the move, bringing new kinds of life. Healthy institutions and churches regularly invest time and resources to step back, as we have been doing, to ask if they're actually doing what they intend to do, or if they're investing in survival, institutional survival. As Phyllis Tickle notes, dying to previous ways of doing religion and embracing a new way of life is essential for the growth of Christianity. This conversation that we're having about contents and containers, about endings and beginnings, is critical to the ministry and the well-being of faith communities for we who are the followers of Jesus today and those who come following us. I believe that the church that emerges from this rummage sale is likely to be as shockingly inclusive as Jesus was. A church that will live out its life in the world as he did. With doors open as his arms were, its heart as open to the world as his was, its resources as invested in caring for the world and its people as his resources of love and passion were. The practical questions of how we incorporate new ways of being Christian into the life of an established institutional congregation with a nearly 140-year history matters. The practical questions matter a lot. How we get new cloth onto an old garment, how we pour new wine into the wineskins that we have been making for this purpose matters. It will make all the difference for us and for the world. May it be so. May it be so. Amen.